Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
I think first of all we should realize that mysticism is not a matter of visions, of hearing voices or having apparitions or seeing the Lord or seeing visions of the Blessed Virgin Mary. I guess we would call those people visionaries, but mystics really are quite different. Mystics are people who fundamentally sense the unity of our world, that they have this rather sharp and strong experience that all of us are one, that they are united and immersed in the world of nature, that they're at one with the reality that's really at work in this world of ours.
Joining Father Bacik in today's discussion is Sister Eileen Simon, a religion teacher at St. Ursula Academy in Toledo. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of mysticism, the experience of oneness. Here's Father Bacik.
Eileen, thank you for coming and speaking a bit with me on the program. I know that you have just completed your master's degree in spirituality out at San Francisco, University of San Francisco, and have taken many classes in the area of spirituality, and I think that perhaps you've done some things that bear on the question of mysticism, which is what I'd like to talk about. Didn't you have a course from William Johnston one time?
Yes, it was a course in mysticism, East-West tradition, and there he explored crossing over to the Eastern tradition to hopefully come back and be enriched within our Christian tradition, the contributions that the East has to give to the West and vice versa.
Well, that might be a good thing then to keep in mind as we begin to talk about mysticism. Maybe we can draw a bit on kind of things that you took up. I think William Johnston is a Christian himself, right? And
yes.
Was trying to make use of some of the Eastern traditions, as I recall it. What's
Correct.
the title of one of his books?
Well, he has about 4 or 5. One of his first was Silent Music, The Inner Eye of Love, and one of his recent books is The Mere Mind.
Okay, well, we'll try to make use of some of that. When we use the word mysticism right away, I think that often puts people off. It sounds like a strange word, or that we're talking about things that are totally divorced from our common human experience. And I think it's important probably to try to zero in right away on what that word mysticism is all about, or who these mystical people are. I think first of all we should realize that mysticism is not a matter of visions, of hearing voices, or having apparitions, or seeing the Lord, or seeing visions of the Blessed Virgin Mary. I guess we would call those people visionaries, but mystics really are quite different. Mystics are people who fundamentally sense the unity of our world, that they have this rather sharp and strong experience that all of us are one, that they are united and immersed in the world of nature, that they're at one with the reality that's really at work in this world of ours. Some of them will talk about their very close union with Almighty God. I think of St. Teresa of Avila, who great Spanish mystic of the 16th century, who talked about the spiritual marriage as a way of talking about this unity, that the experience she had in her religious life of closeness to God was like the close union that people would have in marriage, where the two become one flesh. So she chose to talk about the spiritual marriage. But I think in all the mystics you see that the common element really is this sense of oneness, the unity and harmony that they perceive in the world. You were mentioning the Eastern traditions again. I think that there we probably see this sense of unity played out in a little different way. What I often talk about is the oceanic feeling, where their notion is that the human being in this experience of God, and finally in the end time after this earth life is over, that it's like being a drop in the ocean, that the drop simply becomes immersed in the all. Did Johnson talk about that at all, and that notion of unity that we're bringing up here, and especially from the Eastern tradition?
Yes, that very much is you might say, one of the fruits of the whole experience of enlightenment, of mysticism in the Eastern tradition. He crossed over very much to look at the contributions of the Zen Buddhist. The Zen, za meaning to sit and Zen meaning to meditate, is the experience of, or goal, to self-realization, of coming to the true self, a sense of oneness, and in that experience, a oneness of the whole universe, a oneness with all of nature. And there's a great value to the Buddhist, and also I think very much within the Japanese tradition too. The Zen is to become your true self, to walk, to talk, to sit, to jog, to speak, and to enter into that present moment. And in doing that, one experiences a sense of oneness with all of reality.
Yeah, I think the mystics often find that hard to speak about, don't they? They find it difficult to express this unity because it seems to be beyond anything else that we normally perceive in life. Most of us are far more aware of the differences in life. We realize how we're cut off and separate from other human beings, how it's hard to share our deepest feelings with others, and that even when we try to tell other people exactly what we're thinking and feeling, that they often don't really appreciate it, or they don't treasure it, or they can't understand it. Very often we find ourselves cut off from nature. I suppose in our modern world that happens a lot when we live in cities and where technology takes over, and we really don't have any first-hand contact very often with the things of nature. We're no longer immersed in the world of things like people were in the past, perhaps not so dependent upon nature as we were. And so I think that we get out of touch that way. And for most of us, I suppose we sense that same distance from our God. So how often do you hear people say that, well, I pray, but I don't feel God is close, or I'm more in touch with the absence of God. So people will talk about God's silence and not being able to hear Him, or saying their prayers and hearing no answer from God. Usually we feel our creatureliness, our weakness. Very many times people talk about feeling guilty in relationship to God, so that they feel cut off or estranged from God. And very often, I guess, we end up feeling estranged from ourselves, where we don't even feel peaceful or united in ourselves. We're pulled in many different directions. We feel these splits in the center of our being. We're tugged in many different directions. We can't seem to get ourselves integrated. So people will talk about, well, my head and my heart aren't together. My heart tells me I feel like doing this, but my head tells me and says to me, don't do that. So very often we feel this conflict. So we've got all of this estrangement or alienation going on as our normal experience, that we're cut off from other people, from nature, from God, and even from ourselves. And yet these mystics keep coming along and saying, hey, that's not how it really is. You know, life isn't like that. There's a hidden truth here. There's a deeper thing that you don't see, and that in this one blinding, flashing experience, I really saw it, or I really was able to be in touch with this. And they keep claiming that they see a truth that the rest of us don't really experience.
Yes, I think your point of saying the mystics say that the separation or the difference, that isn't the normal. I think that's the question that they would raise to us, that there is another way. Johnson often spoke of the inner eye. It's to come to a oneness within self, is to walk, to be in a whole new way. It's to look at life in a whole new way. It's not to get caught in the past, and it's not to get caught in the future. And I think so often in our contemporary world, that is very much a reality. We get into a sense of being alienated from ourselves or alienated from others because we are moving at such a fast pace. We are bombarded in so many ways, or get caught up in our anxieties and allow our fears and pressures to control us instead of us being in charge of our own life, and taking time to be still within, to be one with self, so that as we experience life, life doesn't take us, but we choose life.
That's interesting, that inner eye. Do you want to say a little bit more about that, what he meant by that? That's a common phrase, isn't it, in the mystical literature? What exactly does that indicate to you?
Well, the inner eye, simply put, is the experience of love. For the mystic, mysticism is the experience of being loved by God, and discovering that the mystery, the gracious mystery, is God and I am I. And in that experience of an overwhelming love, that I have the capacity to look at all of life in a new way.
Okay, so when we say inner eye, are we talking about being able to see in a particular way? Or are we talking about the true self, or is that kind of idea combined?
I think that idea combined.
So that there's a true self, and that true self, when we're in touch with it, enables us to see in a different way, or to see life in a new and richer way, especially to see the unity.
See a sense of unity and a sense of oneness, that there's more that we have in common than what separates us, that it isn't our color that separates us, that it isn't in the cities that we live in that separates us, it isn't in the job position that separates us, but that there is a oneness in all that we share.
And the mystic tends to emphasize that and see that more clearly. I like the way you're trying to give that a practical application, which I think is to say that even if we are not mystics ourselves, that we can learn something from these people who do talk like that. And they're suggesting that our ordinary way of perceiving the world may not be the best way of looking at it, that there might be a deeper truth that it's helpful for us to be in touch with. I was thinking that it might help if we just sort of looked at an example of a mystical experience here, the way a mystic would describe it. I'm going to read one from Arthur Koestler, who this occurred in an experience during the Spanish Civil War back in the 30s. And Arthur Koestler was a Marxist at the time, and really not a believer in God in any way. And it's an interesting thing to point out that even people who don't believe in God explicitly, or don't talk about God, have these mystical type experiences at times. In fact, I saw a survey done by Andrew Greeley that suggested about 20% of people at some time or another have something close to this type of mystical experience. And if you ask them if they're mystics, they're probably going to say no. But if you describe the experience in some way, they'll often say, oh yeah, I had something like that. So it's sort of interesting here. I read some of this. Koestler is in prison, and he starts drawing some mathematical symbols on the wall of his jail cell. And he says, and then as he's doing that, for the first time, I suddenly understood the reason for this enchantment. He started to feel this enchanted kind of spirit. And he says that he understood that the scribbled symbols on the wall, these mathematical symbols, represented one of the rare cases where you could say something about the infinite which is arrived at by precise and finite means. And he says the infinite is a mystical mass shrouded in a haze, and yet it was possible to gain some knowledge of it without losing oneself in ambiguities. The significance of this swept over me like a wave. The wave had originated in an articulate verbal insight, but this evaporated at once, leaving in its wake only a wordless essence, a fragrance of eternity, a quiver of the arrow in the blue. I must have stood there for some minutes in trance with a wordless awareness that this is perfect, until I noticed some slight mental discomfort nagging at the back of my mind, some trivial circumstance that marred the perfection of the moment. Then I remembered the nature of that irrelevant annoyance. I was, of course, in prison and might be shot. But this was immediately answered by a feeling whose verbal translation would be, so what? Is that all? Have you got nothing more serious to worry about? An answer so spontaneous, fresh, and amused, as if the intruding annoyance had been the loss of a collar stud. Then I was floating on my back in a river of peace, under bridges of silence. It came from nowhere and flowed nowhere. Then there was no river and no I. The I had ceased to exist. I think that's an interesting passage. I think it's interesting because it was composed by a Marxist, and that the catalyst for the experience was really a scribbling on the walls of mathematical symbols. I think it's interesting that he had a great deal of trouble trying to describe the experience. It's hard to put into any words. It's also interesting that it didn't last for a long time, rather brief, which is typical of mystical experiences. But then, and then it gave him this sense of peace. That was all that counted, this union with the whole of reality. The fact that he was going to get shot didn't seem to be all that important in the face of this. And then these beautiful phrases at the end which give us this sense of unity, where he's floating on his back in a river of peace. And then suddenly there's no river and no I. He melts into the all. He becomes the part of the whole thing. Now, I suppose that most people, when they hear that, would say, well, I never really had an experience that intense. And yet I wonder if there aren't times when we might all be able to say, well, there's something a little bit like that, when I felt integrated, or I felt at peace somehow, I felt at one, I felt united with the people that I loved. God, instead of feeling absent, seemed really close to me, and that there was a warmth coming from my God, and so on. Now, we wouldn't call those full-blown mystical experiences, but they certainly move in that kind of direction. So we have there that sense of unity. I wonder too, we're talking about the East and the West. Now this would sound to me rather Eastern, because what happens here is the I gets lost. The very last phrase is the I had ceased to exist. And that's much closer to what we would call this oceanic sense that the Eastern mystics often talk about, where the I is completely lost in God. The Hindus say Atman is Brahman, that is, the true self, Atman, is really one with Brahman, the essential reality of the whole world. It is what we in the West often call pantheism, that is, a total union with reality. So Kessler sounds very much like the East there to me. And on the other hand, when we talk about something like Teresa of Avila, a Western Spanish mystic, her idea of a spiritual marriage makes it seem as though the I is still there, that you don't lose your individuality. You continue to be yourself. You're never so caught up in the other or in the all that you lose your individuality. In fact, when we talk about heaven in the Western tradition, it sounds a lot different than nirvana does, for example, in the Buddhist tradition. So for us, heaven, we retain our individuality, so our images of heaven really are the heavenly banquet, like being at a great wedding feast or moving around in the holy city. Those are images that in which we retain our individuality. But in the East, those images are different. The I ceases to exist and gets caught up in the all. The self, which is totally unreal, is now extinguished once and for all in the experience of nirvana.
Yes. I think within the Western tradition, though, too, there's a sense of coming to self-realization. There's a sense of coming to individualization, and yet there's a sense of loss of I, too. It's discovery of self in a way that one never knew self before. It's at a deeper level of being, and that is what William Johnson speaks of when he talks of the inner eye of love, that it doesn't just stop with self-realization, but there's a sense of self-transcendence. And that only takes place, I think, in and through the experience of faith and the experience of love. Love in terms of, I think, being committed to going out of oneself, the experience of social action, being attentive to issues that concern us today, that can call forth a greater sense of unity in our society at a whole, where man and woman can come together, where black and white, migrant, social worker, that all can come together and walk in unity, that we need one another.
Yeah, I think that again is the real practical application of all of this, isn't it? And that therefore the mystics have a real message for us. I think many people have wanted to take the mystics and sort of set them aside and say they're unimportant. interestingly enough, I guess, in our own Catholic heritage, when many of us studied, for example, that very little talk was ever done along the line of mysticism. I don't think that it was considered to be an essential part of the theological world, or we often distinguished out mystical theology from ascetical theology, and that from systematic theology. That meant that the big thing was to study the dogmas and the doctrines, so on, and to get those straight and to go back to the scriptures. Whereas this whole other world of people like St. Catherine of Siena and St. Francis of Assisi and John of the Cross, another Spanish mystic of the 16th century, and also Teresa of Avila, who we've mentioned, the great German mystics of a preceding age, Meister Eckhart being one of the most famous ones. That was not really taught a whole lot, and I think very often it seems as though we missed the real essence of what religion was all about because of that. We were so caught up in more of a rationalistic approach to religion, a head trip. Religion was amounted more to an intellectual assent to certain truths. And the mystics really moved us in another direction because they kept insisting all the time that the essence of religion was experiential. It was something you went through, something that you were immersed in. That this God you were talking about was not just someone far away off in the sky, and not just someone you made up sentences or dogmas or doctrines about, but someone who drew near, who came close, who brought one into his own divine love, and who called us to share that with others. So there's a very strong experiential base in the mystics' approach, constantly saying to us that, religion's got to do with the heart. Religion's got to do with what makes you tick in the center of your being. Religion's got to do with a strong emotional sense of being caught up with God, and that very often one can't talk about this easily. Very often theology falls into the idea, well, we can say very clear, distinct things about God, got precise ways of defining him. You learn in a catechism exactly who he is and who he isn't and so on. And yet the mystics have said, oh, be careful. You can't put it all that clearly. It's hard to put into words. It's hard to say what this unity is all about. This experience is so great, being caught up into the heavens, as Paul says, that we really can't say it clearly anymore. So that becomes one of the marks, too, I think, of the mystic, the holding back and saying, hey, I can't say too much about all of this.
Mystics really have a message of hope, then, to give to the everyday experience of human life when we realize that it isn't just a head trip or knowing all the dogmas or the 10 Commandments or the rules or regulations, but it is an experience of the heart. It is the experience of the whole person responding in freedom before the Lord and choosing life as I seek God in my everyday life about me, seeing Him in the world about me.
Yes, again, the practical kind of application, the suggestion that they really are messengers of hope for us. They tell us that, I guess in one way what they tell us that along that line, isn't it, that what we really want can happen, and that is we really want to be united. I don't think any of us like to feel cut off. One of the worst experiences in life is to feel like one doesn't belong, that one isn't accepted into a group, that one is alienated in one's world, that one feels homeless. No place where I really feel comfortable. And the worst experience of all, I suppose, is when inside of ourselves we feel those terrible tugs and when we're pulled and where we can't seem to get quieted down or we can't get the kind of inner peace we would like. And the mystics in that way, I would say, give us that hope that indeed all of that can be overcome, that there's a power in the world that wants to unite rather than push us apart, that the harmony is really the way human life ought to go, and that it's possible somehow to get closer to that in this life. And of course, finally, what the mystics are always telling us is that there is a union with God after this life, that death is really a passageway into a life of complete and total union with one another and with God. I guess that's our Christian sense, that we're united with Jesus Christ, and in that we find our true happiness after we've passed through death. Well, we talking, I guess, along that practical kind of line. I like that emphasis, Eileen, that you keep putting on it, so that we don't think of the mystics or the talk of mystical experiences just being something for a relative few in our world. So I've tried to go over the idea that mysticism involves a sense of unity, a oneness with God, with nature, with other people, and with ourselves. And that when we begin to hear that message, that the rest of us who aren't mystics can really pick up something from that. I keep saying the rest of us who aren't. I mean, I put myself in that category. I've never had a mystical experience, really. I don't know if you have or not. Should have asked you that earlier. Well, maybe we'll save that for another time. But for many of us who have not had the mystical experience, we still end up learning something, some hidden truths, and maybe it tells us we ought to be working a little harder to get more unity in our lives and try to do a little bit more of trying to see the commonness of human nature and empathize with other people who are in the same struggles that we're in, really. And to really get some of that hope that you stressed, which I think is really good, a hope that the deepest longings of my heart really will be fulfilled, that I don't have to be alienated all the rest of my life or estranged, but there is an opportunity, and our belief is that finally one day we will be completely united with one another and with the good God who is the Father of all of us.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Sister Eileen Simon, a religion teacher at St. Ursula Academy in Toledo. The topic of this week's reflection was mysticism, the experience of oneness. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.